All right, we're on the second video for periodization, and we want to talk about other concepts and theories that should be applied or at least considered when employing periodized training models. This first one we've talked about before, and it's variability in the training stimuli. So when we're training, one of the most obvious manipulations of the training stimuli is to increase the load. This would be progressive overload, like we've talked about. But there are limits to increasing the training load every single time due to the staleness that can occur. So what is staleness? Staleness due to the recovery period needed before that training with the same load or greater load can occur again. So this kind of results in time constraints. So every time we lift heavier, there's going to be longer rest demands because we're going to be more sore, we're going to be tired, we've lost our energy stores. So instead of increasing the training load every time we train, in order to create a variability, what we can do in some cases is manipulate the exercises. Normally, I would ask y'all, how do we manipulate the exercises? And it's varying the exercise selection, so just the types of exercises we're choosing, or increase the lift technicality. So exercise manipulation can be used to vary the neuromuscular or the neuromotor recruitment patterns, and it still provides a really good stimulus to the body. So vary exercise selection, change up our assistance, our core, our structural, our power exercises. We can add supersets, compound sets, complex sets, possibly do drop sets or heavy negatives or cluster sets. And then progress from front squat to hang clean to power clean to snatch. So there's lots of things we can do to change up our exercises. So that's kind of one example. Instead of changing the load, we can change the exercises that we're doing. Make them more technical or just do exercises that recruit different motor units. But we want to caution, too much variability can reduce the potential for the body to adapt to that stimulus. So that would possibly reduce the development of skill acquisition, but we do want to avoid monotonous training, and then we also want to avoid an overly varied training program. So again, it's a balance. So the next concept we want to look at is something called delayed transformation. So I'll kind of read this definition, and that'll help me kind of get on the right track to explaining this. So we all know there's a time delay between when we increase the training load and when we actually see improvements in performance. So that time delay is dependent on a lot of factors. But what this kind of concept says is the training load should be decreased before an important competition because of that time delay. There's a delay until we actually see an improvement. In layman's terms, what does this mean? The human body has to have rest in a recovery period in order to adapt and be ready for performance. That transformation period is correlated with the magnitude or the intensity of the training load. So the greater the intensity, the longer the rest period needed in order to see that performance accumulate. Someone asked how long is the length of the transformation period, and it can be anywhere from a few days to 1 to 2 weeks. But again, the higher the training load, the greater time needed to adapt. So the greater the transformation period. That's why our recovery period is so important. For some of us who've been training, you may notice that you've been increasing your intensity, you're working harder, your sessions are more intense, but you still haven't seen any changes yet. And then let's say after a week and a half to 2 weeks, you notice finally that you're stronger, you're faster, you can run further. And that's due to you probably gave a rest period. You probably gave your body some time to recover after those really intense training sessions. And that's what delayed transformation is. It takes a little bit of time in order for all of those performances or all of those adaptations to actually see an improvement in performance. Our next one is delayed transmutation. So what is this one? Again, I'll kind of read it to you and then we'll discuss it. So we know, and this again is talking about athletes and competition, but you can apply it to yourself, just thinking about like you and yourself exercising. But this one is more sport specific. So as the time leading up to an important competition decreases, meaning that competition is getting closer and closer. This says that our exercises should become more sport specific. So this is based on the principle of specificity. So another big statement, by transitioning into more sport-specific exercise as our competition gets closer, the non-specific fitness abilities transmutate into specific fitness abilities. So normally I would turn it over to the class to discuss with the people around you what an example of this concept is. The key point here is understanding what it means for non-specific fitness transmutating into specific fitness. So I'll give you two examples. So we have a sprinter. So down here in this picture, we have our sprinter and kind of before competition, so let's say we're a few months out, they're training for explosiveness, power type training with resistance training. So they're doing a lot of Olympic lifts, a lot of plyometric work, and then some track work. But what the goal is that's non-specific fitness. I'm powerful, I'm explosive due to the Olympic lifts and the plyometrics. But the goal is to be explosive on the track. So the transmutation part comes in where all that non-specific fitness that I gained due to my resistance training, that's going to transmutate to where I'm going to be more explosive off the blocks. And I'm going to be more explosive in my arm pump as I'm sprinting. So that's transmutation. Another example, let's say we have a distance runner and she's doing a lot of muscular endurance work. She's doing a lot of fatiguing, high volume work at lower intensities. And she's doing long duration runs. But then the transmutation comes in to where now she's running her marathon and the ability of her muscles to continue to contract for 2 to 4 hours without stopping. That's the specific fitness because that relates to her marathon performance. But she got that performance by doing resistance training with muscular endurance protocols and then obviously some endurance runs. But that's taking non-specific fitness and transmutating it into something fit or something specific that we can work with in our sport. All right, so next let's talk about something called training residuals. So training residuals use retaining loads. So the use of a retaining load to maintain fitness during season is kind of what we're discussing. One thing to keep in mind is I'm going to say a lot of stuff about like sports and competition and training in season, and you may have been a high school or you may be a college athlete and you may not relate to these constructs at all. Just keep in mind that all these theories are they're not used by every single coach. They're not used by every single trainer. So something that I discussed today, you may not have done as an athlete growing up or as an athlete now. Just remember it all depends on the coach and the team, the trainers that you all had. But every training protocol is going to be different for everybody. So first, what are training residuals? So moderate to high intensity training prior to a deload equals longer training residuals. So training residuals are the effect of training and how long the effects of all that training we did, how long that actually lasts. So it's to what extent training adaptation deteriorates after detraining or a deload during a sports season or near that certain competition. So it's the acute withdrawal of a training volume or training intensity. So the strength that we achieved prior to season, we can maintain that in season around our competition by using retaining loads as opposed to stimulating loads. In season, when competition is close, we are probably not using stimulating loads anymore. Stimulating loads are used in the off season and in the preseason, but in season, we normally just want to retain or maintain what we had previously achieved. So the goal is preservation, not improvement of strength during competition. Because during competition, all we're focused on is our competing, actually competing in our sport, our races, our events, whatever that is. So athletes who play a sport for a long, demanding season can follow a strength maintenance program. So what training residuals are used? This is suggested by the NSCA that we can maintain those residuals by 30 to 40-minute heavy resistance training sessions twice per week. And that's it. One thing to keep in mind is greater training age and greater experience of a given athlete will have longer training residuals. So the physical abilities that have been developed for a long period of time can be maintained for a longer period of time before a decrease in performance following a deload starts to occur. Remember that phrase, soon ripe, soon rotten. So if you're soon ripe, you just started training, if you take off and try to use a maintenance load or retaining loads, you may soon rotten. But somebody who has been training for a long period of time, many years, their training residuals will last a lot longer. Structural changes to the muscle like hypertrophy and strength last longer than enzymatic adaptations, which is like buffering capacity, phosphocreatine stores, and neural changes such as motor unit recruitment and firing rate. All right, so that kind of gets us to another part of this lecture, which actually starts to talk about periodization. So these are kind of the lecture objectives. We'll learn kind of the purpose and theory behind periodization. We'll learn the different terms to discuss periodized cycles. And then we'll learn some different models: linear, nonlinear, undulating, Bompa, and conjugate. And then that gets us into assignment 4. So I'll discuss assignment 4 in a video, and I'll kind of go through all of that. So I'll do that, I think, in the next video, but let's get started kind of discussing some of these constructs. So first, let's talk about adaptation. The main objective of training is to create adaptation. We cannot induce adaptations if we don't use stimulating loads and if we don't train differently than how we have before. So this is just something to kind of keep in mind as we go through these periodization models, is there must be an exercise overload applied to the training. We must have some sort of overload. We must use stimulating loads to see additional changes. Also, sport specific. So for your assignments, you're working with a certain athlete, you're working with a sport, and so you need to be familiar with those sport specific constructs in order to design a program that mimics those characteristics of your sport. Also, we want to make sure our training loads vary over time. We want to avoid accommodation. So again, your assignment is hypothetical, but just let's say you were doing this for real. You were actually creating a training program. We'll learn about variability some more and how to manipulate different training variables to avoid accommodation. Also, it's adjusted individually for each athlete. And this one is true for y'all because you're all working with a different athlete and you all have different ideas on the best way to train that person. And so just remember, everything is individually. It's a customized program. And then we'll discuss the importance of rest and how rest can be included throughout our different phases. So this gets us to our big definition of what is periodization. So periodization is a theoretical and practical construct that has evolved into various forms over time. So this is just kind of the basic model here, what most of them use. Again, I'll read this: a strategy to promote long-term training, so over many different seasons across a year or so, and performance improvements with pre-planned systematic variations. So we have a plan when we design our program. We know exactly what we want out of each phase. We'll learn what systematic variations are, but it's just changing up the specificity, intensity, and volume of our training, and we're going to organize our training into periods or cycles throughout this program. So for optimal adaptation, another word for training is, or this type of training is cyclic variations. It's variations based on certain cycles. So we'll learn how to manipulate intensity from high, moderate to low, volume, velocity of our contractions, frequency of training, and then adding sport-specific skills. So let's discuss how did this originate. So there's a lot of different sport scientists that claim they created periodization, or they're the father of periodization. But the classic linear model was created by Russian sport scientists in the 1960s. Monitored training volumes and intensities during different seasons and tracked patterns of success, so a peak in performance. And then they matched that peak with competition. So periodization was also created because as an athlete becomes more trained and has a greater training age, it becomes more difficult to stimulate adaptations and see gains in performance. But the success of a resistance training program centers around the ability to induce specific adaptations and translate those adaptations into improved performance. So periodization sequences around these factors to see improvements in performance and peaks at certain points. So we must learn how to modulate training stressors to enhance the adaptive response, reduce performance plateaus, and avoid overtraining. So it's a logistically designed program allowing variation in training throughout each cycle. So another definition we see up here, long-term planning, so we already know that, where peak in performance is achieved through potentiation, management of fatigue, and accommodation. So the word potentiation we've used a lot. It's basically organizing training into different cycles to achieve the desired effect at the desired time. It's basically building an endurance base, preparing the body for higher intensity work later on. Accommodation, we know, is talking about how performance will stagnate when the same training load is used over and over again. So we want to avoid accommodation by making quantitative and qualitative changes to the program. The key concept is to divide our seasons into smaller, manageable blocks. So training blocks with the ultimate goal in mind. The ultimate goal is to achieve peak performance at the most important time throughout training seasons. This is best achieved when our training uses a varied structure. One thing to also know, it is not possible for an athlete to achieve or maintain peak performance year-round, or even for a certain amount of months. So periodization is based on the fact that peak performance is very short-lived. So I would normally ask the class, how long do you think a peak in performance actually lasts? It's shorter than you would think. It's only about 1 to 2 weeks. And this is the tip-top performance that an athlete has ever been in. We cannot maintain that. Training programs that attempt to place an athlete in peak condition for longer than 2 months or trying to extend that may result in reduced fitness and overtraining. So 1 to 2 weeks, we think about the Olympics and certain competitions. When do those competitions, or how long do they occur? They're actually very short. Our peak performance window is small, but we can hit several peaks throughout a training program. So it's not like we hit it once and we're not going to hit it again for another year. We can design a program where we hit multiple peaks. Some of you may be thinking, well, what about like a season, like a soccer season or a football season? That would be using a maintenance program rather than a peaking program. And we'll learn the difference between the two. But maintenance programs are usually used for team sports that span an entire season and last for many months. Where doing a peak performance program, that would be like if I'm an Olympic athlete and I have one single competition, I would use this peaking program instead. So let's get into some terms for periodization. And our first term Our first terms are kind of be looking at our longer duration period. So a multi-year plan we see is a 4-year plan or a quadrennial plan. Multi-years are obviously the greatest amount of time, but they're the least detailed. So normally I would ask you, when would a 4-year training plan, when would that occur for what type of athletes? Most of you would probably say Olympians, and you're correct. Olympics occur every 4 years. So for an Olympic athlete, we would have a plan for each year of our, or kind of getting up to the Olympics. And then some of you would also say, what about collegiate athletes who start as a freshman, sophomore, junior, senior? So this would contain key developmental goals targeted for each year. So each year we plan, or we want to make sure our athletes hit these milestones. We have an annual training plan, which is just 1 year. So it just talks about 1 year, what is kind of going on in that year program. The annual is developed based on athletes' progression throughout various seasons. So if you have one competitive season, you would be represented as a macro cycle. But if you had 2 competitive seasons, you would be divided into 2 macro cycles, which would fit into our annual training plan. You would be like, who has 2 competitive sports seasons? Track has an indoor and outdoor season, and then tennis also has 2. So what I want you to think of the macro cycle is we're just going to call the macro cycle as just like our large annual plan. So it's our largest plan, and it's usually going to be several months, but it can be up to an entire year. The mesocycle is going to be more important for you to understand. We're going to use that term a lot. We see mesocycle can be 2 to 6 weeks, but for the purposes of this class, it's going to be referred to as a 4-week block of training. So mesocycles are also our training blocks, or blocks of training. So a meso, 4 weeks. With our meso, we have 4 mesos each of 4 weeks. Those are going to fit into our macro cycle. And then next we have a microcycle. We can see several weeks to 2 weeks, but for the purposes of this class, we're going to use 1 week. So it's going to be a 1-week training plan. So it's basically small size training that's basically composed of multiple workouts. So it's just like, what's our goal for this whole week? So week 1, what does our workout look like? And then week 2 would be a separate microcycle. And if we had 4 different microcycles, that would be our mesocycle. So they kind of all fit into each other. And then we see our training day here is just 1 day. What does our day look like? Our sessions, this would be like if we had 2 training sessions in 1 day. What you need to know is what is the definition of a microcycle, definition of a mesocycle, and a macrocycle. So those are going to be the 3 different cycles that we use to discuss our training in this lecture. So what I would normally have you do now is based on the last few slides, what do you think the primary goals of our periodization models are? So I would normally have you think about this and then you would answer. It's a very broad question, but what our goals are is to hit peak performance by avoiding accommodation, avoiding overtraining. The way we do this is cyclic variations in training using training blocks to potentiate our athletes and hit that peak in performance.